let's just appreciate China and Russia are very different. What counts as good data in Russia is not going to count as good data in China. And the only way you know that is actually some more like social, cultural, or like something like an ethnographic sort of knowledge.
Oh, absolutely. This distinction between China and Russia is extremely important. Is it true that the China-Russia relationship is deepening on a multifaceted basis? No question about it. Is it the case that China and Russia share a number of grievances against the West, and I think particularly against the United States? Undoubtedly the case. And yet, it's important that we not lump China and Russia together. Just imagine sort of you're making sort of just a very simple chart, and in column one you say, here are China and Russia shared grievances. I think you could populate that list very, very quickly. If on the other side of the column you say, what are the elements of China and Russia's shared affirmative vision of international order? I think you would have a lot harder, more difficulty filling out that side of the ledger, and it's because China and Russia are different in many ways.
Welcome, Ali, to Navigating Noise, the podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you on. And I've been, I just got to know you a few months ago, and I've really enjoyed reading about some of your works that you have out there. I hope we have a chance to talk about that. But how about we just start here with you telling us a little bit about yourself and about how you've gotten to where you are professionally.
Thank you for having me on. The pleasure is all mine. I love what you're doing with Filter Labs, and I'm just really, really excited to see where it goes. And thanks for having me on the ride. So a little bit about me. So we were actually just talking a little bit just before starting the conversation. If you had told me, 15 or 20 years ago that I would be interested in political science, geopolitics, international relations, I would have been incredulous. And I would say roughly, if I had to sort of demarcate my life professionally, 9/11 was an important inflection point, and I know that observation sounds trite, but certainly true in my case, and I know in the cases of many other folks in my age cohort. But up until 9/11, I barely read, barely wrote. I loved math. I thought I was going to do something, either math or something math adjacent. 9/11 was a real wake-up call for me. It awakened me not only to how insular I had been about the world, but it was also a reminder that being surrounded by friends and fish, as the expression goes, it doesn't necessarily insulate you from dangers. And so 9/11 happened my junior year of high school, and then, of course, the following year, my senior year of high school, we were debating whether or not to intervene in Iraq. And I ended up taking a gap year between high school and college, not because I didn't feel that I was academically ready to go to school, but because I felt that I had kind of rushed through high school. I had been just kind of on autopilot, trying to sort of check certain boxes in order to make myself more competitive to get into college. And I felt that it was important for me to take stock in light of 9/11, in light of this debate over whether or not to invade Iraq. And I wanted to become worldlier. I just had this abstract goal of becoming worldlier. And it was during that gap year that, as a result of certain conversations I had, certain books that I read, certain experiences that I accrued, that I made the switch. And I decided that rather than doing sort of math or something math adjacent, that I would do political science. And then in terms of how I got interested in China, the U.S. China relationship, which are the topics that I focus on most these days. I should say that actually, even when I was in college, so I had made this shift to political science, but I wasn't thinking about China that much, or the U.S.-China relationship. I was actually thinking, again, like many others who started college after 9/11, I was thinking of studying the intersection of Middle Eastern geopolitics, counterterrorism, weapons of mass destruction. But between when I started college in 2004 and when I graduated, I felt a growing disconnect between what I was writing papers on, what I was learning about in class, and what I felt were some of the real tectonic shifts that were taking place in geopolitics. And so in 2004, when I started college, folks would talk about China and they would lump it in with the rest of the BRICS. So the BRICS is this acronym: Brazil, Russia, India, China. And folks would say, oh, China, it's just one of the BRICS. By the time I graduated in 2008, most folks were saying, okay, well, China certainly is not on par with the United States, but it really doesn't feel right analytically to lump it in with the rest of the BRICS. And in 2008, I think 2008 was really the year that kind of sealed the deal, as it were, for me. You have the Beijing Olympics, and then you have the global financial crisis. And I think that confluence of events, or that sequence of events, really made me think, look, the big story, or a big story of our times, it's a resurgent China, and the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, that's fascinating it kind of resonates with me a lot because how I sometimes often tell people like filter labs, like we're kind of really like known initially was about like Russian analysis in and around the Russian-Ukraine war. Now we do a lot in China, and but really like you, well, I got into this and the Middle East was everything. And it was like stuff on counterterrorism, like the original stuff that we were doing was trying to track like religious groups and whether they were going to be violent or whether they were just like peaceably fundamentalist, and we needed to tell the difference and try to find some way, some signals out of their discourse to do that. Really hard problem. We didn't exactly solve the problem, but it was like, and I feel like there's a whole generation of us that came like into college right around 9/11, out of college it's still there, and like the problem set or how we solve problems in around Middle East was like kind of fundamentally they shaped how we saw things. And I guess one thing that I've often thought about is that there was a pretty significant power asymmetry between the U.S. and a lot of these Middle Eastern power countries, and I've been wondering whether or not like that has been hard for us in very subtle ways, and we haven't really acknowledged for it to get over that. Like the same asymmetries do not exist with China and the U.S.
Jonathan, you hit on a point that there's actually something very, I don't want to sound too meta, but there's a very profound psychological element in what you just said, which I think is often underappreciated in discussions of U.S. China competition. So when we talk about the relationship, we talk about military competition, technological competition, economic competition, diplomatic competition, all very real forms of competition, all very consequential forms of competition that are playing out globally. But again, and here I'll kind of connect the geopolitical to the personal, and just by way of relating a little bit of my own, kind of personal journey and how the discrepancy between what I thought China would be and what China has become, how that discrepancy has informed my present interests. I came of age in the early 90s. So if you rewind the clock to the early 90s, when we talk about the end of history, it's important to remember, and I think it's difficult for folks who are coming of age now to appreciate the extent to which the end of history wasn't just a geopolitical construct in the early 1990s. It was part of a much broader cultural zeitgeist, a societal zeitgeist. And so when I was growing up, I remember my parents were immigrants. My parents are from Pakistan, and so they coming to the United States, they have obviously they spend time in the United States. Obviously, they come from thousands of miles away, and so they were always acutely aware, fundamentally aware that there is a world beyond America. They were born outside of the United States. So when I was growing up, and I remember when I was, I think maybe I was six or seven, I'm forgetting which, but when I was relatively young, and when my parents saw that I had this interest in math, for one of my young birthdays, they bought me a TI-83 graphing calculator, and they realized, they said, oh goodness, we've made a big mistake, because now he's reading even less and he's just punching away at his calculator. They were always exhorting me when I was growing up. They said, Ali, there's a world out there. You can't just bury your head in your calculator. Please read a newspaper, read a book, learn about the rest of the world. And at the time, I would respond and I'd say, oh, I don't like reading and I just want to do math. Subconsciously, in retrospect, I think when they exhorted me to learn about the rest of the world, subconsciously, I think I thought to myself, I have the luxury of insularity. I have the luxury of parochialism. Why do I need to learn about the rest of the world? Because of this asymmetry that you talked about. If you had said to me let's just rewind the clock exactly 30 years, if you had said to me in 1994 that in 30 years' time, a country that many of us thought was on the wrong side of history, a country that in many ways is the antithesis of the United States, very isolated, very impoverished. If you had said to me 30 years ago that country is going to be America's principal strategic competitor, I would have been incredulous. So I think a very important part of what we are grappling with now, we meaning the United States, a very important element of competition, it's psychological. How do you reconcile your own pretension to exceptionalism with the reality that your principal competitor now has its own claim to exceptionalism, and again, in many ways, is antithetical to you. Very different timeline, a much longer timeline, very different understanding of history, very obviously different approach to domestic governance, very different conception of international order. And we can enumerate many other differences. But this psychological element, Jonathan, that you got at in your question, I don't think you can overstate the importance. And so just to foot stomp what you said and underscore that when we talk about how competition between Washington and Beijing is evolving, yes, of course, let's focus on those sort of traditional dimensions of competition, but let's place more of an emphasis on how psychology and how narrative, how they shape that competition as well.
Yeah, so that was something I was kind of intrigued by. Also, and I've been increasingly intrigued by this, is that like these cultural, social, and like what you were saying, psychological dynamics within the country, within us. What's the pathway for those being integrated into policy decision making process? I've gotten the sense, I've always sat outside, whether it's in academia, and doing research that's kind of adjacent to certain concerns in the government, or in a company that, interfaces and works with governments around the world, that that they're much more comfortable thinking about like figuring out what some leader thinks or is going to do there, like what does she think about X? They're always trying to find that, or what's the economic reality there, but they're less comfortable with trying to think about these cultural and social dynamics. I mean, in your experience, has that been a? I mean, am I right in kind of seeing that it's there's some discomfort in that, and but also, what do you imagine is the pathway for U.S. policymakers coming to a much more culturally sensitive understanding of China and its reality there, knowing that it's kind of hard. It's a country far away, very different language. There's obviously some overlaps in our expat communities and things like that. But how does it get in to our process?
We have to be intentional. I mean, I'll be blunt in saying so. We have to be intentional, and lest I sort of cast any aspersions or wag my finger, I implicate myself in this challenge that we have. As I said, so first of all, when I was growing up, I was, I would say for roughly the first half of my life, I really almost sort of pretended that the rest of the world didn't exist, and I felt that a certain level of American centrality, I regarded a certain level of American centrality as akin to oxygen, as akin to a constitutional amendment. It's immutable. It's not going to change. So I had in my own mind, I think in part because I kind of came of age sort of steeped in this end of history milieu, I had what in retrospect proved to be a very ossified conception of the world. And I underestimated the extent to which the Chinas, the Russias of the world would find ways of reasserting their influence and contesting U.S. influence. So we have to be intentional. And again, just to incorporate an element of conversation that going back to just before we started our conversation, but just we were talking beforehand, in terms of intentionality. So maybe, if I were talking to if I were talking to myself, a 20-year-old version of myself or a 15-year-old version of myself, if I were doing high school all over again, college all over again, graduate school all over again, I would have placed far more of an emphasis on different kinds of courses. So I would have still taken political science courses. I would have still taken international relations courses. But knowing what I know now, I would have placed far more of an emphasis on anthropology, sociology, psychology, history, because if you're trying to understand, and I should say, in fairness, efforts at mutual understanding, they have to go both ways. And so I know that we've sort of principally been talking about what sort of U.S. interlocutors can do to better understand what's going on inside China. But China isn't, I would argue, China's not doing itself any favors, and China really has made the task a lot harder for for not just U.S. interlocutors, but for, I would say, Western interlocutors, or even just outside interlocutors more generally. I can't tell you, Jonathan, the number of conversations I have had with some of the world's luminaries of some of the world's foremost sinologists, and some of them have said, Ali, the kinds of access that we used to have inside China, access to high level Chinese counterparts, counterparts who were within bounds, of course, but were relatively candid in giving us a sense of what was going on inside China. They said a lot of those channels have either become much less functional or in some cases have disappeared. And so if some of the world's luminaries find that China is something of a black box, and if some of the world's luminaries of sinology are speculating, I would hope that sort of friends in China would recalibrate, if only for their own interest, because and here is where, again, an intersection of sort of the personal and the geopolitical. The less country A knows about the inner workings of country B and vice versa, the more likely country A is to impute malign motivations to any actions coming from country B and vice versa. In a vacuum of understanding, prudential reasoning dictates that you maybe not assume the worst, but that you consider the worst intentions coming from your counterpart. But we have to be more intentional. We have to learn more about history. We have to understand. We have to also understand for foreign counterparts, whether they are allied counterparts or partner counterparts, or whether they are competitive counterparts or even adversarial counterparts, as best as possible, trying to understand for a given leader, what were this leader's formative experiences? Who were this leader's formative mentors? What periods of history shaped how this leader thinks? And I'll just stop because I know I'm going on a bit, but I'll just stop with sort of two concepts that have resonated with me a lot, and that I think we need to inject even more into our national security conversations. Number one, the more you steep yourself in history and some of these other disciplines that I mentioned, the more likely you will be and the more inclined you will be to engage in strategic empathy. And I want to distinguish between strategic empathy and strategic sympathy. Strategic empathy does not mean that you agree with the intentions of your counterpart. It does not mean that you agree with the actions of your counterpart. Strategic empathy simply means that in a dispassionate, analytical, rigorous way, you try and inhabit the shoes of your interlocutor and try and understand, if I were to occupy that person's shoes, how and why might I render the decisions that my counterpart has made? So strategic empathy, and then I'll stop with a second concept. I know that in my own case, I have sometimes succumbed to projection bias. So when leader X takes a certain decision, sometimes my impulse has been to say, that action is irrational. That action is unstrategic. That action is illogical. But I'm engaging in projection bias. And what some of my friends and colleagues have urged me to appreciate more is that, Ali, look, you're projecting your own conception of rationality onto somebody else. From that individual's perspective, that individual may well think, given that individual's mental models and personal upbringing and formative experiences, that individual may well think, I am acting rationally. So we need to cultivate greater strategic empathy, and we also need to be on guard against succumbing to projection bias.
Yeah, so this seems, I think you're right, or it's hard to argue with this, right? That but it seems like what you're saying, if I can say this, is like what we really need is something more like personal knowledge. You need those personal contacts with people there, and I mean, it does seem that it's harder. I think you pointed out once to me the imbalance between how many U.S. university students study in China versus how many study in the U.S., and such that they are actually developing relationships. As a time of teaching, even in graduate school and things like that, at universities, I've made a lot of great friends, but they're here in my culture, and I'm not there in their culture, and it seems that knowing that, and let's just say we can't reverse this in a big way. Well, what are the ways that we can try to understand a society from afar? Like,
Yeah.
can you give us some tips on how we would do that? If like, okay, I'm right now sitting in Germany, but I'm normally sitting, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And if I'm sitting there in the Boston area and I'm trying to understand something, I'm trying to develop strategic empathy, I'm trying to check my projection bias. How do I do that? And I don't want to just like go sit and read history. I want to like keep up with the real time. Like, what do I do?
Yeah, absolutely. It's. I should say that I hasten to note that there's going to be a significant discrepancy between the profundity of your question and the impoverishment of my answer, because it's a really I grapple with this question every day. But a few, again, impoverished thoughts, but a few thoughts nonetheless. One is, the good news is, and I'm an irrepressible, perhaps hopeless optimist, but guilty as charged. Um, I think the good news is that even though now there is that imbalance that you noted between the number of students from China who are in the United States and the number of students from the United States who are in China, and according to our ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, I think that number is now fewer than 1,000, which is quite alarming. But we do have several generations. It's very, very sobering. And I worry, just as a footnote, I worry that when you have, I think the high water mark, I think in the 2011 to 2012 academic year, I think we had roughly 15,000 American students in China.
So we went from 15,000 to 1,000.
Under 1,000, under 1,000.
Under
So I
a
think that
thousand.
now under
Yeah.
1,000. And we have also seen a substantial reduction in the number of Chinese students in the United States, but starting from a much, much higher baseline. I think at the high water mark, well over 300,000, students from China. So a big imbalance. And I do worry about, do we run the risk of cultivating the next cadre of China watchers in the United States in a vacuum if they haven't been to China, develop those cultural linkages and so forth. But getting back to your question, the good news is that I think despite some of the fraying of sort of societal context now, we do have several generations of those luminaries I mentioned. We do have several generations of China hands in the United States, alive and well today, writing today, engaging today, who have spent a lot of time in China, who do have very significant networks inside of China, who do have trusted sources. And again, I realize what I'm saying now is perhaps slightly in tension with what I was saying earlier. It is true that even for some of the world's foremost sinologists who are based here in the United States, it is true that for some of them, they may not enjoy the same level of access that they once did, and they may not have as extensive a set of networks inside of China, but they still do have, I think, extensive networks inside of China. So I guess step one would be, if your own access is diminished or non-existent, learning as much as you can from generations of China hands who have come before you, who do have those contacts inside the country, who do have those experiences inside the country, and recognizing, of course, and they would be the first to issue this caveat. They would say, look, when I was last in China, the situation in China is different than it was when I last visited, and the kinds of contacts I have in China might not be the contacts you might want to engage. But nonetheless, learning from those who do have significant experience inside of China, number one. Number two, I just noted that we have several 100,000 students from China studying in the United States, trying to engage with them, whether it's if you happen to be, let's say you're a college or university student, again, intentionality, reaching out to Chinese counterparts and just asking them about their experiences. And I think also, I would say, when you ask about, and I would take this point not just I would make this point not just in the context of the U.S. China relationship, but I want to make a broader point here. I think if you're trying to cultivate strategic empathy, or if you're trying to learn about what's going on inside of another country, whatever your objective might be, and especially if you have a sense going into a conversation that here's a conversation where there are many potential friction points, many potential discourse landmines, rather than going into a conversation and being hostile or asking questions that might might sort of turn somebody away. You're looking to gain trust. You're looking to learn knowledge, or you're looking to gain knowledge, and you're looking to gain trust. And so I think when you approach one of those conversations with somebody who might be a little bit wary of talking with you, rather than saying, what is your view of the U.S. China relationship? Maybe you can have that conversation later, but I think just by way of starting, just to say, oh, how long, what are you studying? So I'm trying to sort of simulate kind of a hypothetical conversation.
Yeah, it's like getting to know them as a person, like where like
getting to know them as a person, getting to know them as a person.
Yeah, I mean, so just to I mean, I guess I'm hearing all this, and I'm kind of wondering, what do we do like when we're doing like sentiment analysis of local populations in China?
Yeah.
Like, what value does that add here? If all of that is kind of like if that personal knowledge and all those relationships that are really kind of driving, it seems like that's kind of the major motor of the kind of China watcher there. What does like some of this data analysis, whether it's like tracking the actual status of the economy in this province or like population attitudes, what does that contribute to the China watcher and to who wants to develop these virtuous habits of observing China?
Well, they reinforce each other, and I think so. I would say that whether it's at the broadest level, quantitative analysis, qualitative analysis, sentiment analysis versus perhaps again some more let's say economic analysis, but I don't view them as, I view them as complementary, and I think that they both are indispensable. So you do want to understand, let's say, here's one good example of how you might pair them. So right now, China's economy is experiencing a number of headwinds. So we won't know until sort of early next year what China's growth rate was for 2024. But let's say it's going to be, if China were able to register 5% growth this year, 5% would be, I think, quite an accomplishment. I think the greater likelihood is the growth comes in somewhere between 4 and 5%. You have a high rate of youth unemployment. You have an economy that is slowing down, I think, on a structural basis for a number of reasons, whether it's demographic decline, the difficulties of shifting from sort of a former growth model to a newer growth model, a number of factors at work. So I think that combining that data analysis with sentiment analysis, so engaging with the youth of China and saying, tell me about, let's say if you recently graduated from college, have you been able to find work? If so, what kind of work are you doing? Do you feel that the government is doing enough to help you, make that transition and help you find work? So I think that's an example where, just looking at the hard data and then combining that hard data with sentiment analysis is very important. All of these different layers of analysis, they help you develop a more textured, I would use a few words. One, a more textured sense of the country, but also a sense of its granularities, its complexities, its contradictions. And one point that I think is especially important, I would say about China, but I think you could make this point about any other country, is even now, and again, I realize that as we're talking that I'm making this mistake. When we say, what does China want or what does America want? I mean, even that question, the reductionism implicit in saying what does China want, it's what do 1.4 billion people want, and what do each of those individuals?
They don't want one thing,
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there are many Chinas, there are many populations, there are many Chinas, and there are many different sets of ambitions, and so we have to be careful to disaggregate, not to aggregate. Number one, and I'll just conclude here, and here is why you need as many different kinds of analysis as possible. So whether it's quantitative, qualitative, sentiment, economic, whatever kind of other juxtapositions you want to insert, is something that I've noticed in the discourse. And again, I'm sitting in DC. I can't speak for anywhere else. But sitting in DC, I have noticed a certain kind of analytical schizophrenia in the discourse about China. And I sometimes joke with friends and colleagues that, when I wake up in the morning, I'll read an op-ed saying, China is kind of gliding, towards, global dominance. Look at the strides it's making in technology. It's ruled by this technocratic elite that can see decades into the future. And then before I go to bed, I'll read another op-ed saying Xi Jinping is in over his head. He's not getting good quality information from his top advisors. The economy is plateauing. He's engendering greater resistance from advanced industrial democracies. And so, China could be reaching sort of the precipice of its power in world affairs. And once it reaches that precipice, it's then going to decline steadily. It doesn't have the capability to deal with structural challenges. So is China gliding towards hegemony, or is it staring down decline? My own view is that neither of those assessments is accurate. I think that China is likely to prove an enduring competitor to the United States, but a constrained one. And what all of those different kinds of analysis can do, economic analysis, sentiment analysis, various forms of quantitative and qualitative analysis, the more levels, the more layers, the more kinds of analysis you introduce, the more you're able to tease out the contradictions, the complexities, the nuances of China, and recognize that there isn't one unitary China, but there are in fact an infinite number of Chinas.
Yeah. So this tracks almost exactly like what we've found in places like Russia and Iran, other places that we pay a lot of attention to. I think it's true of any society that there's going to be these contradictions, tensions there. And maybe a very, very strong authoritarian or totalitarian form of like North Korea might somehow suppress all that, such that it doesn't matter so much. But I guess we've thought a lot about like how we might like put these different types of data streams together, like the economic, the social statistics, what people are saying online. And I guess increasingly, and I've mentioned this to you, that like this is kind of like the tagline that I keep kind of returning to is that ethnography precedes technology. And what I mean by technology is like all the data all the technology we use to go and try to understand someone. And that I guess I'm trying to think through how, what's the workflow a little bit here. And it feels like we do have to start with some encounter with them as people, with them in some way to build the right tools, to even find the right data, and then not to mention be able to interpret it in a responsible way. And that's, because there's going to be these regional kind of variations, of course, in a country as complex as China. But let's even just before we get to that level, let's just appreciate even that China and Russia are very different.
Very
and
different.
Such that we're going to be what counts as good data in Russia is not going to count as good data in China. There, and the only way you know that is actually some more social, cultural, or something like an ethnographic sort of knowledge.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I mean, Jonathan, and again, my passion coming through, but I'm really glad that you made this point, and it hadn't even occurred to me, but this distinction between China and Russia is extremely important. You mentioned sort of ethnography precedes technology, which just 3 words, but there's so much meaning in those 3 words. I really like it. Very pithy, but very profound. And it's also very important, and I'm glad that you mentioned the distinction between China and Russia. I think I understand that sometimes for purposes of narrative, we were talking about narrative earlier, for purposes of narrative, or for purposes of making a complex world seem more geopolitically accessible and geopolitically manageable, there's a tendency to lump certain countries into categories. So we all remember the notion of an axis of evil from about 2 decades ago. Now, is it true that China and Russia, is it true that the China-Russia relationship is deepening on a multifaceted basis? No question about it. Is it the case that China and Russia share a number of grievances against the West, and I think particularly against the United States? Undoubtedly the case. And yet, it's important that we not lump China and Russia together. So when we say, our goal is to, we have to contend with a China-Russia authoritarian axis. If you make just imagine sort of you're making sort of just a very simple kind of, sort of a simple chart. And in column one, you say, here are China and Russia shared grievances. I think you could populate that list very, very quickly. If on the other side of the column you say, what are the elements of China and Russia's shared affirmative vision of international order? I think you would have a lot harder, you would have a lot more difficulty filling out that side of the ledger. And it's because China and Russia are different in many ways. So,
Well, I mean, just to like say here, I think this has like been one that I've been like seeing as like this like blinking red light about the China-Russia relationship is the tension between how like Putin wants a world where everyone's equal. He does not want hegemony. And that's really baked in. He does not like it in the US. And eventually he's not going to like it in China. But like that's what she seems to be wanting is something like hegemony here, and such that they're on this collision course on this, and eventually they're not going to really like hold this together. But in thinking that I've been thinking a little bit more about your kind of concept, and I want to ask you to expand on about great power opportunity versus great power competition, because and you know this, and you grew up in a world where like great power competition was just the framework there that exists, and it makes a lot of intuitive sense to people, right? People go to war, right? And we see that people compete for resources, people compete for technological dominance, and that so. Tell us a little bit more. Like, what do you mean by great power opportunity there, and how it's like somehow criticizing or pointing out some shortcomings of our competition framework, and what are those shortcomings? I guess I'm also kind of wanting to know.
I appreciate I appreciate your you're plugging the concept, and I should say that the concept of great power opportunity, in a way I was kind of forced to articulate it when I was writing when I was writing my book a few years ago. So just in terms of the genesis of the book, initially it was going to be, I mean, it's a short book. Initially it was going to be even shorter. I had initially intended the book to be almost just exclusively a critique of great power competition. And so I set forth this argument in the book. The great power competition, analytically, it captures some very important dynamics in international relations, and some of those dynamics that you were just articulating. The international system today is far more competitive, far more contested, far more complex than it was at the end of the Cold War. China and Russia are increasingly cooperating with one another, pushing back against the United States and the international order that the United States principally undergirds. And so I make the point that great power competition as a descriptively captures some very important elements. But I worried then when I wrote the book, and I continue to worry now about turning description into prescription. And for a number of reasons. One, I mean, competitive dynamics, yes, they are far more salient today than they were, at the end of the Cold War, but they don't capture the totality of dynamics between countries. And I think that there's a risk that if you believe that relations are irreducibly competitive, you can create a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you can reduce your own capacity, if not willingness, to countenance the possibility that maybe your relationships with certain countries could change. Maybe they're strained today, but they could change over time, and you reduce the space for creative diplomacy. But the reason that I came up with the phrase great power opportunity was when I submitted the initial draft of my proposal to my editor, and then the editor circulated my proposal to some anonymous reviewers. One of the pieces of feedback that I received, and even from people with friends and colleagues with whom I shared my draft, people said, Ali, look, I agree with some of your critiques of great power competition. I disagree with others. But let's say, for argument's sake, that I, meaning friends, colleagues, anonymous reviewers, let's say hypothetically that I agree wholesale with your critique of great power competition. The more strenuously you critique a framework that's gained a lot of traction, the more of an intellectual responsibility you have to offer an alternative. So what I try to do in the final chapter of the book, where I kind of articulate great power opportunity, the upshot is it possible, and I believe the answer is yes, there's the irrepressible optimist in me again, is it possible for the United States to articulate a foreign policy that can stand on its own merits without having to invoke our competitors? Is it possible to have a foreign policy in which we are articulating an affirmative conception of the world that we would like to see, rather than just reacting to what China and Russia are doing. And I worry that, again, to the extent that great power competition has become a really dominant framework, and to the extent that we are turning description into prescription, are we allowing our competitors to dictate the terms and the course and the cadence of our foreign policy? So the great power opportunity is to articulate a foreign policy that isn't so rigidly tethered to the statements, the actions, the intentions of our competitors. And I think that more broadly, and here's where I know we've been talking mainly about the United States and China and talking about Russia a little bit, but let's bring in the rest of the world too. The overwhelming majority of countries in the world, they don't want to participate in a new Cold War or participate in a new round of great power competition, but they think in much more pragmatic terms. And so, for a lot of I mentioned just before we started, talking. My parents are from Pakistan originally. They're immigrants. When I talk to family, relatives in Pakistan, they're not steeped in the intricacies of Xi Jinping thought. But what my relatives will say to me is, Ali, look, we have a middle class that is struggling, particularly after COVID-19 and disruptions to food and energy markets after Russia invaded Ukraine. So we have those disruptions. We're struggling to lift up our middle class. We have a very high rate of youth unemployment. And when you're dealing with that confluence of challenges, you're thinking in much more pragmatic terms. I need trade. I need investment. I need infrastructure. So America, if you come to me with offerings, great. If China comes with offerings, great. They're not thinking about the ideological character of the country that is offering them trade, investment, and infrastructure. It's all a way of saying that I think that the United States, as well as part of seizing this great power opportunity, is really recalibrating, I think at a very fundamental level, the way in which we engage with this vast swath of countries that comprise the global majority, the global south, whatever your preferred nomenclature. And rather than going to those countries and saying, or conveying or intimating that we view them largely as instruments of great power competition, saying, we want to partner with you on your own terms. We want to help you on your own terms. How can we do that?
So I think this is fascinating, and to some extent, like it's hard to argue with you on one level here about, like, yeah, we should be defining this in our own terms. I guess I kind of hesitate a little bit about that. One is that it's a foreign policy. It's like it's kind of baked in that we're going to be responding to others.
Yes.
And so that's okay to some extent, and it's going to be like there. It's hard to eradicate it, and I think maybe what you're like calling for is it's kind of a softening of that a little bit. But I guess we're like just hearing you talk here with this example. It reminds me of something of like these small countries have foreign policies. And we often think about like the U.S. having a foreign policy, Russia having one, maybe like countries in the G7 have foreign policy, and all these other people are just like pawns in our games. And that I increasingly think that we need, like, particularly when we're trying to, like, at Filter Labs, go in and understand a small country, we have to understand that they have their own foreign policy.
Yes.
and it's not going to be on our terms. And actually, we're highly distorting if we just see it all as competition there. And this comes down to like some stuff we're doing in like Nigeria and the like China's, involvement and investment there through the Belt and Road Initiative, trying to understand like local responses to it. They're just not seeing it in the way that I think a lot of people are framing it.
Jonathan, what you just said right now is, from your lips, whether you're religious or secular, but from your lips to God's ears, preach. It's music to my ears. And I think you said something which points to a distinction that I've come to appreciate more and more so during the Cold War, we had a set of countries that were non-aligned, but a term that I've seen increasingly come into vogue, and it's a term that I think he coined it, but the Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar, when you ask him what is India's kind of foreign policy stance, so remember, India was one of the principal non-aligned countries in the Cold War. What Foreign Minister Jaishankar says today about India is we're not non-aligned, we're multi-aligned. And I remember the first time I encountered that phrase, I remember my initial reaction. I said, non-aligned, multi-aligned. This is a semantic game. But the more of his interviews that I saw, and the more purchase that I saw this notion of multi-alignment getting, the more it goes to the point you were making, which is increasingly countries today are saying, one, we don't have to make a choice between the United States or China. Two, we have our own agency to pursue our own foreign policy. And three, there is a sense that in some cases, maybe you can play great powers off of one another. So a form of agency. There's a sense that because the United States and China are both looking to court certain countries, that you gain influence that way. But to your point, just about sort of pragmatism about ideology, when you are sort of a smaller country, if you are, say, like, Singapore, for example, I was at earlier this year, I was at the Aspen Security Forum, and I think the opening speaker was the defense minister from Singapore. And Singapore and the Singaporean defense minister said, look, we need good relations with China. China is just by virtue of geographic proximity and economic linkages. We need good relations with the United States, principally in the security domain. And so we have to balance. We have to juggle. And so when you are forced by virtue of geopolitical necessity to balance these very difficult relationships, you become geopolitically adept. You become strategically agile. But I think the more that we can, whether it's countries in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, wherever they may be, the more that we appreciate, and not appreciate just in some perfunctory sense, but appreciate at a visceral level, the more we appreciate that every country is going to look at the world differently. Every country wants to exercise agency. Every country wants to be seen on its own merits. The more I think we'll be able to craft a durable foreign policy, a sensitive foreign policy, a prudent foreign policy that really endears us to a wider swath of the world's people. And so I think that what you said, the work that Filter Labs is doing, really doing sentiment analysis and trying to get sort of a more granular sense of what other countries outside of this kind of great power context think, I think that work is going to be indispensable, not only for academics, but also for policymakers and I think a whole host of other individuals around the world. So I think it's very vital analysis that you're doing.
Well, yeah, thank you.
Of course.
Our time is like here at the end. I feel like we could like keep going, and
I'd love to. Yeah.
you just like mentioned India, which I feel like that to me is like one of the more fascinating things.
Absolutely.
I heard someone a while ago, someone who's kind of, I guess, more of on the conservative side of the foreign policy, American foreign policy, Walter Russell Mead. He said, 30 years ago, if you were kind of smart, and you went to someone who kind of was a grand man in the foreign policy, they would say, go, kind of learn Mandarin, study Chinese, get to know that. He said today, the advice would be get to know India, learn their language, learn the people. This country is going to be systemically more important going forward. It's already right now has the largest population in the world. But sorry, so this is a lot of a whole nother thing, and maybe we can have you back on to talk about that, particularly with your background in Pakistan, which is a place I've done some research, some like population
kidding. Where?
Analysis in Lahore.
Oh my gosh, that's where mom and dad are. That's mom and dad are from Lahore. So
okay, Lahore is like the most culturally rich city in the world.
Yeah.
And so like we don't have
that warms my heart.
We don't have anything in the West quite like that confluence of rich cultures. Well, we can get onto that. Sorry, kind of veered out of control here right at the end, out of enthusiasm. But just here to conclude, how can people find you either online or kind of find your works? Because obviously, I think a lot of our listeners are going to be super keen to kind of go and follow up a lot what you said here.
Oh, well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much. I feel like we could have gone on for several hours, and I do want to come back. So online, on Twitter or X, I guess, depending on how folks call it, my handle, it's just my first name _ my last name. So at Ali _Wyne, if you want to follow me on Twitter or X. I'm also on LinkedIn. Again, just you type in Ali Wyne LinkedIn, just do a Google search and you can find me on LinkedIn. Please connect with me there. And I'm on Facebook. I don't use it as much, but I'm on Facebook as well. I'm always happy to connect with people there. And then in terms of my day job, if you want to sort of define me there, I work at a wonderful organization I joined at the beginning of this year. It's called the International Crisis Group. It's headquartered in Brussels. And we're coming up on our 30th birthday. And the mandate of the International Crisis Group is, I guess it's twofold. A, to prevent new armed conflicts, and B, to try and bring about resolutions to ongoing armed conflicts. And so I'm working to build up the International Crisis Group's portfolio on the U.S. China relationship. So would love to engage with folks who are interested in learning more about crisis groups work, but many ways of finding me. And really, I know we're probably over time, but I want to say how much, Jonathan, I've enjoyed this conversation, how much it meant to me that you and Marguerite reached out. I love the work you're doing, and I think that the synergy of perspectives that you're bringing to bear really is the way of the future for understanding people, societies, geopolitical developments. So thanks for having me on. I really hope that this first conversation is that our conversation is the first of many to come. And I wish you and your colleagues at Filter Labs the very best. I think you're going to have a big impact.
Well, thank you. I'm pretty certain this is just the first of several. So anyway,
I
well,
hope
thank
so.
you very much.
No, thank you.